Hello and most cordial welcome to Context, a programme devoted to thoughtful inquiry and informed discussions of the principal affairs of the day. The long conflict between Russia and Ukraine has entered another perilous chapter. In the early watches of this very day, the city of Kyiv was subjected to a most ferocious aerial onslaught, a barrage of missiles and drones, resulting in the lamentable loss of no fewer than 9 souls, and the grievous injury to many more have been recorded. The fresh assault occurred at a time when murmurs of diplomacy resound in international chambers, with a US plan proposing a cessation of hostilities in exchange for considerable territorial concessions, amongst them the recognition of Crimea as part of Russia, being firmly rejected by Kyiv to the chagrin or open annoyance of President Donald Trump. In the meantime, President Volodymyr Zelensky, having cut his South Africa visit short, has returned in haste to his embattled capital, denouncing the attacks with resolute firmness and reaffirming his unwavering stance on the sanctity of Ukrainian sovereignty. The latest attack prompted President Donald Trump to rebuke Russian President Vladimir Putin, with many finding this rebuke not so efficient and to no avail. But again, we are brought once more to that fateful juncture at which the horrors of war contend with tenuous hopes of peace. And to help us make sense of this grave situation, we are joined by 2 distinguished experts, Daniela Meller, a political scientist joining from Boston, United States, and Alexandra Filipenko joining from Vilnius. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Daniela Meller, Ukraine is under attack, and the United States is exerting pressure on Ukraine to accept a proposal that envisages the recognition of Russian control over Crimea and also other concessions. President Donald Trump, posting on his Truth Social platform, criticized attacks and said that they were not necessary, and he said that they were badly timed. What conclusions are to be drawn when bombs fall from the sky and when the proposals of this kind are being made simultaneously?
Hello to everybody and to those who are watching us. The situation is an unstable situation and a volatile situation, perhaps too volatile for foreign policy, but it is what we have to deal with coming from the Trump administration. And I say this not necessarily as a criticism, it is in fact a problem that the Trump administration is shifting positions so quickly and so willing to launch ultimatums to Ukraine in order to try to move the process forward. So one of the takeaways from the developments this week is that President Trump is becoming impatient. He wants movement on the situation. He attempted to broker a ceasefire. That ceasefire has only partially worked and for a very short period of time. The Ukrainians continue to insist on a longer-term ceasefire, and they agreed to that, but the Russians clearly didn't. The president is becoming preoccupied, certainly, with the lack of movement here. He wants to decouple from Europe, he wants to decouple from the situation in Ukraine, he wants to turn his attention towards China, towards the Middle East. And the message that he's sending, frankly, is that he is willing to sacrifice many of the red lines of the Ukrainians in order to achieve a peace. And now, whether that peace can be a stable peace, given the proposals on the table, is a whole different question. And once again, on the wake of negotiations with the Europeans, the Ukrainians, and the Russians, the president is going to continue the meeting with the Russians because Vitkov is going to meet with President Putin once again this week, but he pulled away from meeting with the Europeans and meeting with the Ukrainians on what was believed to be a critical meeting in the United Kingdom to be able to move the process forward. So once again, we have the United States brokering a potential deal with the Russians that leaves out the Europeans and leaves out the Ukrainians, while at the same time launching an ultimatum to Zelensky that the Americans might pull out if Zelensky doesn't bend.
We'll come to a point, but we'll come to possibility as to what will happen if US decides to really walk away from the process a bit later. Alexander Filipenko, President Trump believes that he can save Ukraine. In fact, he believes he's the only person who can actually save Ukraine. With all due seriousness, might we suggest that asking Ukraine to surrender territory in pursuit of peace is somewhat akin to offering a man half a lifeboat and calling it salvation? Because effectively what Ukraine is being told now is that if Ukraine does not go the direction of compromise, and compromise in this particular case involves surrender of sovereignty over Crimea and possibly certain sections of the eastern Ukraine, country will lose the opportunity to retain the possibility of being a proper country. So what do you make of that US position, which is effectively based on extreme pressure being applied in relation to Ukraine?
It is definitely extreme pressure, and definitely the fact that State Secretary Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff did not go to the meeting in London is also part of this extreme pressure. But the amazing thing is that recognition of Crimea is actually illegal under the American law. Under the American law, according to two acts countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act that was adopted in 2017 and Ukraine Freedom Support Act that was adopted after the original annexation of Crimea in 2014, under those two acts actually that are part of American law, there is, for example, in the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, there is, I quote, Section 257.3, to never recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea by the government of the Russian Federation or the separation of any portion of Ukrainian territory through the use of military force. So in other words, recognizing Crimea as Russian is not just diplomatically strange, let's put it this way, it's bluntly illegal under the US law. So actually Congress must have a say in it, and Donald Trump with his act cannot just recognize Crimea as Russian, because this is against the US law. This is blatantly illegal. So this way of negotiating is, it seems a little bit strange, but we must say that this information have come to us through different sources, but reliable sources, but still through the press. And as Marco Rubio have said many, many times, we should not negotiate through the press. So maybe this is not exactly the way that the proposal would be, but still Donald Trump never said that this is not the proposal, and he bluntly said it, that he's not happy with Volodymyr Zelensky. And as Donald Trump put it, no one's asking Zelensky to recognize Crimea as Russian, but this is inflammatory on Zelensky's part, just to say that this is a red line. But in any case, this is very, very strange situation, because this was actually signed. That law in 2017 was signed by President Trump. So this might be some kind of some part of the art of the deal, if we could think that this is positioned by President Trump just to say to the Russians, oh, we did all we could, but it's Congress to blame. Congress doesn't allow us to officially recognize Crimea as Russian. I can recognize it as a president, but it's just a proclamation. But this is part of the art of the deal. But all history of Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin's relationship tells us that most probably Donald Trump would like to recognize Crimea, but it is impossible under the current US law.
Of course, an analyst would be able to say that, but circumstances on the ground have changed, the reality has changed. Ukraine was sort of compelled to recognize Russian control, and then this recognition of Russian control gave rise to recognition of Russian sovereignty, with some consequences for the whole international legal system. Daniela, how likely is it that US may actually, in real terms, walk away from the process? Because what is also very interesting about the US participation is that this most recent assault, the largest and gravest since July last year, also makes us ask some questions about the efficiency of the other European countries, the coalition of the willing, as a source of deterrence in relation to Russia.
Well, it's a possibility that we have to take seriously. Once again, because in part Donald Trump needs a victory, and he recognizes that he needs a victory in foreign policy because he is crossing a very difficult moment in this first 100 days of his presidency, in which the ceasefire in Gaza has failed, the attempted ceasefire in Ukraine has failed, the peace negotiations in Ukraine appear to be in tatters. The trade war, he had to retrench severely on it, and now there is talk of potential retrenchment even on the position with China. So the president does need, like this president in particular, because of his personality and because of the way he leads, he needs a win, and we could interpret this particular situation and this ultimatum in a couple of ways. One way is the way that my fellow panelist was expanding on, that perhaps this is a strategy to get the Russians to actually sign onto some agreement and be able to have some movement forward. But it is also likely, or at least equally likely, that this pressure is directed specifically at Zelensky so that the president can say, we tried all that we could. None of these parties want to end the war, so we are washing our hands from the situation. It is a true possibility, and Donald Trump would certainly be able to spin it as a positive for his electorate at home if he actually walked away from this. Now, in terms of the Europeans are trying to both throw their support behind Ukraine, and when I say the Europeans, I mean especially the largest European countries, and here in particular, France, Germany, and the UK have been working together to come up with plans B and C and D for what could possibly happen with Ukraine. An exit from the United States would be a major blow right now because the Europeans have been talking about, for instance, putting troops on the ground to secure Ukraine, but they haven't actually moved to form such a force, as far as I know. So they need some time. They need to delay this exit as much as possible so that they can have time to put into practice the plans that they have been developing to be able to bolster Ukraine's security and defense in the case of an American exit. And my final thought on this is that an American exit could mean at least a couple of things. It could mean an American exit as a mediator. And if that's the case, the Europeans might actually welcome it. There's some scenarios under which, a different mediator might be a positive development for Ukraine. But if this exit means completely withdrawing U.S. military support, the selling of weapons, complete withdrawal of U.S. intelligence, basically removing all possible support from the Ukrainians, then the situation is a lot more dire, and the Europeans will have to act a lot more quickly to be able to replace that, or at least to close part of that gap.
Alexander, turning to Europe's commitment and that of Britain's leadership within the coalition of the willing, to what extent you think this commitment is sustained by public sentiment in those countries? To what extent actually public sentiment there overwhelmingly, or to a certain extent overwhelmingly, favors unfettered support, unwavering support for Ukraine's territorial integrity, because the rhetoric has changed quite considerably over the past few years. I remember last year, during summer, everybody was talking about Ukraine's territorial integrity, including Crimea, being something to be protected by all means and at all costs. And then this question about, well, we need to compromise now, people are being killed on a daily basis, perhaps recognizing Russian control over certain portions of Ukraine is a judicious course of action, seem to prevail in many countries, not just in the United States, but also on this side of the ocean. So my question to you, do you think that public sentiment has also somewhat shifted, not decisively, but to a certain extent, in a way that does not necessarily favor the idea of supporting Ukraine?
Yes, I would absolutely agree. And looking at different polls, we can see that the public opinion has shifted. But if we compare the US history and European history, Europe has its painful history of appeasing the aggressor. As Donald Trump many times have said, there is an ocean between us. So with the ocean between Europe and the United States do not see the situation with Vladimir Putin as that painful. And for the Europeans, of course, this is part of history. This is something that's in the blood, remembering what's been happening right before the Second World War. So for Europeans, even though the public opinion has shifted, and the longer it's away from, the further it's away from the Russian border, the less people, less and less really support the idea of helping Ukraine with weapons and continuing the war. If we talk about Lithuania, where I am at, Lithuania being on the border with Russia and on the border with Belarus is very strong in its support and really wants to help Ukraine more and more any way it can. But the Baltic states are, of course, not as powerful and not as big and economically not as strong as Germany or the UK or France. And that is why the European continent is generally looking at the leaders of the coalition of the willing, and over there, really the heads of the coalition are moving towards the idea that probably things really should freeze on current battle lines. But I think that the Europeans are more willing and more ready to maybe even recognize the territory de facto, but not de jure, in order not to have this precedent of giving up the territory as everyone has seen prior to the Second World War.
Thank you, Alexander. I'd like to pose my last question to Daniela Mele. Daniela, do you believe that administration in Kyiv, a government of President Zelensky, is actually ready for a negotiated settlement in a sense that would involve, in one way or another, very intricate and complicated dance, the delicate minuet of diplomacy, wherein you may agree to something which is wholly unpleasant and wouldn't go nicely in terms of the different quarters of Kyiv and public opinion, but something which will eventually bring something positive. Is the government of President Zelensky ready for unpopular compromise, which could be deemed as part of the very deep strategy with some positive consequences to come later?
I think that we have seen some indications that Zelensky is willing to engage in diplomatic talks to bring a ceasefire into place and to then do a deep dive into all of these intricate issues. But there have to be red lines for a leader like Zelensky. And what he has been signaling in his attempts to deal with the United States and with this positioning by President Donald Trump in particular, is that Ukraine needs to continue to be a sovereign state. He doesn't want Ukraine to become a puppet state of Moscow, sovereign only in name, but in practice, getting directions from Moscow. So that seems to be completely aligned with the Ukrainian public opinion. And clearly, we have seen support by the Ukrainians of President Zelensky actually rise since the situation at the White House that was so confrontational between the two.
Tatiana Miller, Alexander Filipenko, I'm grateful to both of you for your time and for your answers. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it seems that in the grand theatre of international politics, Ukraine finds itself applauded loudly. Yet despite all the support still coming from the coalition of the willing, as far as the United States is concerned, Ukraine is somewhat left alone upon the stage. It remains our purpose not merely to engage in discussions of the principal affairs of the day, but with all due seriousness and clarity, to place today's great events in their proper frame, with some measure of discernment being as an essential component of the discussion under all circumstances. You were watching Context, and see you very soon indeed.